Okay, how about you all sit down? It's an interesting discussion. Don't leave the room, especially if you're not using open source. I would love to hear from you. If you're a big open source fan, then you're less important. But if you're not using, or you know a lot of people who don't use for some reason, please stay.
And don't sit too far back. We're hoping for a bit of audience participation. So.
Okay, let's about start. Feel free to come. I was hoping a bit more. I know a lot of you here at Apricot. That's the main reason here is like, so you wonder maybe another two Western person, not that Asian looking, they start talking about open source in Asia Pacific and what the hell is going on. And the main reason is really, we want to try to figure out better what can the open source community improve to actually make more here in Asia Pacific using open source. So my name is Martin Winter, that's Jane Alcock, so let's just start. First quick, who I am. My name is Martin Winter. I started after I spent too many years at Cisco. I started working in open source and I never regretted it, never looking back. So I started initially working on Quagga, an old project. I started then later my own non-profit, the NetDev Foundation basically. And then also was one of the persons who started the FR routing fork. I'm since the beginning of FR, I'm an FR maintainer and I'm also part of the technical steering committee there. The company itself, as I mentioned before, we are a US non-profit. We are really dedicated to open source and also in the education stuff. So we work sometimes with schools together and we do a lot of open source, but mostly we're working on FR routing. That's our main thing. We're also the ones who run the main CI system for the community next to some of the development.
Hi, I'm Shane Alcock. Some of you may remember me from speaking here about 2 hours ago. So I've been doing open source development for the best part of 20 years now. I started out at the University of Waikato in New Zealand, so I come from a very academic-based background, but now I'm a bit more of a mixture, I guess I would say, between the OpenLI project in particular and then working with some research groups in the US as well. On their projects. So during my time, we've worked on a lot of different pieces of software under research grants, and these have always been things that we've been quite keen to just publish there as open source and continue those projects long after their original sort of research funding ran out. A little more about OpenLI in particular, because that does take up a lot of my time. It's well, it is the world's only open source implementation of the ETSI standards for lawful interception. So this project really aims to provide smaller operators or operators who are less resourced with a way to comply with their lawful interception requirements. So it started out while I was still at the university as a collaboration between ourselves and the networking industry to solve a problem that they had. It's since moved out into a slightly more commercial organization called Searchlight, but it's still an open source project at its core, and they're very committed to maintaining that behavior. So yeah, the project's pretty widely used now. Obviously, we've started out in New Zealand, so we have quite a few users in New Zealand, but it's also expanded beyond that to Europe, Australia, and we field regular inquiries from various other parts of the world as well. So that's me, Martin. Back to you.
So yeah, so as I say, like here, the main thing is this discussion is not about our project mainly. This is more about open source and how can it get better. And when we talk about open source, just wanted to bring that up quickly. So from what I talk, there are some companies who just publish their source code and post it out and don't maintain it. I don't really count it as open source. What we are talking is something which has a license, which really allows you to use it, modify it, change things around. It should have obviously an active community and development stuff, so it's not just one time and use and figure out yourself. There. So you are allowed to join the development on the good project stuff. There are many of the places you can bring your own input, you can potentially bring your own code and all these things. And most of them also offer commercial support, which seems to be, when I talk to people in the hallway, not that well known. And the cool thing is you sometimes can get multiple companies who provide you commercial support, so you can shop around. And also offer paid feature development. So if you go to a vendor and want to buy have some extra features, they may completely ignore you most likely. If you're in open source, you can put your own resources together, or if you don't have that or can't find them, you can potentially pay people in the community to develop it for you, and it's normally much more open there. But back to the main issues, as I work on FR routing, what we see is like, I see a huge user base growing in Europe, where I see like ISPs completely ripping out all their routers and replacing it with like FR routing on their own PC hardware, just because it's cheaper, more flexible, works better, from what I hear. There is a lot of specialized networks who need some features which they can't get from the vendor. They're doing stuff and building things around it. There is, I mean, classic things is firewall vendors, but every firewall vendor has it in there and abuses it. And smaller ISPs, as I say, then the large cloud networks. So if you go to very large cloud networks in the US, most of them are using FR routing or potentially a modified version from it. But the interesting thing is when I look at it, what I see feedback and community thing stuff, it's basically North America, Europe, and then a few other countries, like if I look here, there. And I mentioned here India, China, Japan, South Africa, Brazil. And there is a lot here in Asia Pacific where we see about no contribution, no feedback, and potentially no usage. So, and that's my impression, what I have. That basically, if I look how much people cost in a country, if your salaries in your countries are quite low and you could theoretically afford to hire a lot of people to work on it, you're more likely to buy expensive vendor equipment. If the salaries go up and it really costs you to maintain like developers, then in these countries, I see way more companies willing to invest money there and paying for developers and invest in there and use open source, which is, my view, completely the wrong way around. And also, obviously, keep in mind, normally your support from the vendors is a constant across any economy. They normally don't give you much different prices between where you're living. So this is a statistic from some university. They did a paper. You find in the small print the exact source. I just extracted the first 3 countries and then a few other ones, all the ones I found here in the Southeast, like basically Asia Pacific area. And you can, if you look at it, I have to happily say Switzerland is in the second rank, as I'm from Switzerland. But if you look here, New Zealand, Asia Pacific region, Singapore, then Australia, Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Japan. These are all the countries which many of you may think they could theoretically afford to buy commercial equipment. And the ones who don't have that much money, they are not on the list. And this is obviously contribution, so just usage is a bit harder to track because normally we don't have that much information there. But here the talk is really, and the discussion which we want to do afterwards is like, what do we do wrong? How can we change things to more of you starting to use that? And this is from my personal view. It's like, why should you use open source? You may have a different view, and I would love to hear corrections there. But I mean, I say always support. If you ever tried to get support, I used to work at Cisco for 10 years. If you try to get support there, hardware works, software, they will give you a ticket number and say bye. In the open source, I suggest many people hire a few of your local people, have them learn about it. They can do the first few levels, and then you can just an additional supplemental contract for some support if you still think you need something from like somewhere in the community. And then you have basically your own resources, probably paying way less and having way faster support. The other thing is obviously adopt your own needs. So you can implement your own thing. You may want to potentially give it back to the community so in the next version it still works. And obviously a lot of these things comes down that you can improve your local economy. And it makes me sometimes sad when I see, especially in Asia Pacific, you have a lot of really good engineers. And in some countries, when I talk to people there, they are still concerned, can I find a job in this computer science space after I graduate from university? And in other countries, basically, that's not a discussion. It's a fact. They will have jobs. So it's invest. There is a lot of interesting things. And so you really end up less dependent on others. So yeah, and the last thing is also obviously, you don't, with open source, you don't run out of like, this is no longer supported in general. You can decide to run the support and run the feature as long as you want. Support, as I mentioned before, find local talent. And it's way cheaper than what you may pay support for another thing. And then discuss that with some place if you want, and then you can still get some extra paid support for the backup. So I heard a few people in the hallways when I talked, hey, I can't use open source because I have this checkbox. I need to have a paid support, somebody can call if it doesn't work. And many of the projects will offer that. I'm quite sure you offer that too.
We do indeed. Well, yeah. We offer a range of options.
So yeah. So that's the other thing is like, you may think you're not using much open source, but if you look at it, you may be quite a bit using it. So I assume on DNS servers, probably every one of you uses one like an open source DNS server. So I assume you are there. Management, if you do something, these are a few tools which are quite popular, which are listed here, you may be using. Say on routing, you have different options there. So it's not just one lawful intercept. Sorry, only one option right now, but hey, you can improve it if you don't like it. You can probably pay them for extra features. So you can get and have it done and have a nice solution for your network. So, but that's basically most of the our talk or presentation. I want to really more have an open discussion, and I really want to find out like what can we from the open source community do to basically make it easier for you to start looking at it and help you to succeed with using some of the open source. And that's not specific on any of our two products, it's more in general. So from that is like, I'm really interested. So I'm curious, who is here knows from like fact? I get everyone here using open source in their network. Can you hold up your hand if you think you're using open source? Okay, there are at least about 2 hands who didn't go up. I assume you're not sleeping, so that's very nice to have you here too. So, and if you're using open source, are you contributing back or are you currently just passive downloading and there is, so who is contributing back to the open source? Okay, there's still a few, that's good. I would guess none of you, all of you are in one of the countries which was listed before on the statistics for like who has like active stuff there. So I'm asking, then let me ask different. Anyone here from Cambodia? Or Laos, or, I mean, even Thailand doesn't have much things. Indonesia, Malaysia, and like there. Ah, interesting, good. You have one person there. Are you using open source? Okay, good. It's great to hear. And are you contributing back? Oh, even better. Okay, so we see we have, I don't know how common it is, but at least we have a good exceptions, which I love to hear that. So I'm curious, so anyone here wants to talk about what they think why open source is not really used that much in your community?
Is it? Oh, yeah, it's on now. Hi, this is Dhruv. I wanted to talk about your point number 2, especially the contributing back part. This is mainly in regards with, I've been working with a bunch of students in a lot of standards development work and cases where students take up projects and they do develop, but I have asked these questions as well, like, oh, why did you not push it back to the main and why did you not contribute this thing? And they found that to be a hassle. And I don't know how to, I went back to the professors that you should grade them once, you should give value to contributing back, and somehow that part has been missing in the whole ecosystem. I think it started with the contributing back not being as straightforward. It's very dependent on the kind of community you are in. Some community works in a different way. Some are more mail heavy, some are tickets heavy. And especially for students to get involved, it's not always been like, you need to be a part of the community really well. Then it's easy to contribute back. For an outsider, it's always a bunch of a hassle. So until we make that a little bit easy, especially for the students part, and I don't know exactly what's the best way. I always thought that if the professors have contributed back, they could be the right role models for the students to do it. So I have done, that has been one practice that we did in one of the universities. Like we were like, oh, it's a part of the whole thing, and pick your professors who have experience with it, who can guide you with the whole process. And that's one thing that I want to say, especially from the students' point of view. Next, coming in a different hat, I've worked in a vendor, and that vendor did contribute to ONUS and ODL and some Linux Foundations project earlier. And we found like contributing back is like, sometimes a bit of political as well in an open source. And we thought that that's not going to be the case. It's not going to be hold back who you work for or what's the agenda that you bring out. But it's not like that in open source world as well. There is a bit of politics involved in that side as well, which was very surprising in some ways. So that's the sort of a feedback that I want to bring. Contributing back should have been much easier, but it wasn't. That's the feedback.
Okay, if I take that up. So the first thing you mentioned with like for students and stuff like that to better contribute, this is an issue, and that was discussed a few other places too. We had some discussions at the RIPE meetings in the past one. The problem is it's a challenge a little bit for the projects, because we have seen, especially in FR routing, a lot of people, part of it, they come up with new, the IETF was quite big push when you have a draft, you want to see an open source implementation, but most of the drafts go nowhere. So having code in there which is never used is quite a pain too, because we have to maintain it, we have to worry about the security and all that stuff. So in FR routing community, if it's a draft which isn't implemented, we appreciate when people implement it, but for moving it into the code base, we sometimes hold a bit back because we want to see first, is it actually going somewhere at all? So the second thing is also, we've seen a lot of nice enhancements and ideas sometimes coming from students. Mostly people have to do like a master's or a PhD or something. They implement it, they're hard working on it, and then they get a diploma and nothing shows up anymore, and they completely disappear. And especially if it's something which not everyone is that familiar on it, it's the challenge again. It's like we have to figure out, do we rip it out now, or does somebody else have to learn it and contribute to it? So that's a bit the challenge, why a lot of the open source projects have sometimes a bit problems to get contributions from students in there. How to solve that? To be honest, I don't know really. I mean, it is a bit disappointing, but it's not just implementing new features, it's maintaining it too. And most of the projects, you spend a lot of time maintaining, making sure it works, updating and changing things around. So it's a lot of work there.
Just to add a feedback on that, like one thing that we did with that university is sort of creating an open source club, making sure that ethos of open source gets in. It's things like, if you abandon an open source, anybody who's going to Google your name would remember that you actually abandoned this. This is a project related to, it's available in open source, it's not maintained, it's not a good thing. So if you are doing open source, believe in the ethos of it and commit to it. That sort of a thing, if we bring out in students in the early ages, I think that's one step that we at least thought of doing. It's not been super successful yet, but something to try at least. That
might be one choice, but I have to say, we as NetDev are guilty on the same project too. I mean, we did years back on, especially on FR routing, we implemented Open Fabric. At that time was an IETF draft. And we were very convinced it will go through. It disappeared. It's still in FR routing, and now in the committee's discussion, who is maintaining that code? What should we do with it? It's not the standard anymore, but we still have it in there. So should we rip it out, which is quite some work too, or should we maintain it around? So there is always that discussion. And especially in the open source world, sometimes you don't know is somebody actually using it. Because a lot of us are really in respecting the privacy, and we don't really collect any feedback directly or something. There is no beacon who reports back what features you're using. So we are depending on people speaking up, telling and screaming if we potentially plan to remove the wrong thing. So, but yes, it is a problem, and it's known for new contributors. It's in a lot of open source projects, it's a hard time that the first time they get usually not such a good experience, and they have to have quite a thick skin to try it again and get involved in it. And that is a big problem, and it's a known issue. But the other thing is, I'm not sure if that makes a difference between Asia and anywhere else in the world. So the differences between Asia and other places, you can say maybe the mentality character that people here are more sensitive to critics, where in other Western countries more if they say, if somebody says you are an idiot doing that they may just ignore it and continue anyway, which would be the right way. But yeah.
Hi, Chris Visser from IOJ. I'm kind of just continuing back on the how to get people to start contributing back. Because I remember one of the first ways I got started was years ago. GitHub used to do that project where there's the that month of trying to, if you do X amount of commits, then you get a prize of something, which I think doesn't really exist anymore. But something for the likes of, to get students interested in maybe in a university or type of setback, to have a month type of project like that. Because though the first times trying to contribute to a project can be a bit tough, because you might be unlucky and get a terrible maintainer that wants complete control over everything. But a lot of the times what's probably better to help motivate the students might be a way, not necessarily thinking of contributing to code itself first, but the part that senior developers are especially bad with is documentation. Just because students especially, or newcomers, know exactly the type of things that's missing, because if you're using a product for a long time, you just know how to do stuff. And that could be a way to, for newcomers especially, to help start to contribute. So not really question anything, it's just...
So documentation is great that you bring that up, because I mentioned lots of people, because I hear many times I would love to contribute, but not a good coder. And I just tell them, try out documentation, try to install it, follow the documentation word by word, and tell me where you struggle, and then potentially try to fix the documentation. And yes, that's many projects, they love contributions, and it's a very easy way to get in. The GitHub, that special they did, I know I talked to quite a few open source, and most of them hated it. because you ended up with a lot of pull requests which were just for them to basically compete in there, and maintainers having like a hard time to review and all that stuff. And that costs a lot of work for basically close to nothing useful out of it.
Kevin Maynell, currently the Scion Association. We do have an open source implementation and we do contribute it back. But actually, I really wanted to just make more observations. I don't think I'm actually going to answer any of these questions. It's just, I was sitting here and I realized actually I had quite a long involvement with open source development. I mean, not necessarily as a developer myself, but also as, you know, in working as a project manager and a product manager, but also as trying to raise money to pay for it as well. And I think there's sort of two problems as I see it. One is a lot of the stuff that I was involved with was very, very niche. That had very limited, it had to solve a particular use case, actually in research and education networking primarily. So it had a very sort of small user base, which in turn meant there was sort of less interest perhaps in continuing the development or contributing to that development. So I think there was sort of what I would call the critical mass issue I would see around open source development. And the second one is I was the product manager for a very widely used open source single sign-on piece of software, which is widely used in research and education, which you could probably guess which it is. And that, you know, didn't have the critical mass problem. It had the opposite problem. It was widely used, actually not just in research and education, but in the governments, in public administration. And really the issue there was actually getting people to contribute money towards this. We had developers, we had other contributors who were willing to do this, but it actually paying the actual bills just simply because this has been given for free for so long, as in free, as in people not paying money for this. There was very much reluctance to contribute money to something that they had been getting for free and running multi-million-dollar businesses on the back of. And I just wonder, you know, how do you sort of address that issue, the opposite problem where you do have, you know, there is literally a lot of millions of dollars riding on the back of this, but yet it's very, very hard to raise money to support that.
That is a very difficult problem to solve, and if anyone has any silver bullets, then I would love to be on the receiving end of those, because yeah, that's a problem that we have as well, is, you know, you're effectively giving away the product for free, right? There is nothing stopping anyone from taking your project, deploying it on their systems and just running with it. And if they don't need any help with it, they figured it out, they don't run into any bugs because you do amazing work on the coding side, then that's great for them. But at the same time, somebody still has to maintain this code and keep it up to date and account for new operating systems and new hardware and all of that stuff. And it can be really hard to convince people to pay for that. And a lot of that's, for us at least, has been about reaching out to the community, to our users, and not sort of going out there with a begging bowl in hand per se, but just reminding them that this thing does have a cost to us. You are using it, but if nobody pays for it, then it goes away effectively, right? If there's no one to maintain it, I'll find another job. I'll find something else to do. I don't want to, but you know, there is sort of enough of an implied, I hesitate to use the word threat, but you sort of know what I mean, is that it's kind of one of those sort of ethical problems, right? How many people in that situation choose to buy in to keep this thing going versus those who want a freeload? But yeah, it is a very difficult problem to solve. We've been very lucky that we've had a good community, and most of the people that we're aware of who use our software are more than happy to pay a little bit of even just a nominal support fee that is, in some cases, more like a donation. They don't need the support per se, but they contribute just for the sake of helping keep the project going.
So I want to add to that, with FR routing, we are a little bit okay position right now, because there's a lot of commercial applications. There are a lot of top of rack switches and stuff which they need a routing stack who use FR routing. There's about all the cloud routers and people want, which all use it. There is about lots of firewall providers. But the way I approach it, I always say, like, in our case, FR routing, it's open source, it's free. If you want the code as it is today, it's free, I don't expect any payment. If you later play with it, you figure out it's good for you, you want to use it, and you start really depending on it, then you should be concerned that the code stays around. And you basically should start figuring out how can you help there. And one way is like you can basically pay, donate something. You could potentially, like maybe you have good resources, local ones, and you can start getting active, involved too, or something like that. So, but basically I see it this way, is like go around, try it out, test it, it's free for that, but you may have to worry on long-term maintenance because the project should stay around and you need it supported long-term. But the other thing is too, so I mean, us, we are living mainly from donations and also contract work, so we have companies. So support is always one thing which is quite easy sometimes to have discussion. A lot of people unfortunately think because it's open source, the support should be way, way cheaper. But if you, I mean, companies before who asked me, I have basically 1,000 virtual FR instances as a router. I want to pay support for that. I want any bug fix within 2 weeks, and I pay you about $5,000 a year. And I just had to say, like, that's complete illusion. There's no way that we could do that. So it's time costs too, I mean. But yeah, so it's you can pay back by supporting some of the development sometimes. You can do it yourself. You could potentially pay somebody to do something. You can get sometimes support. It's still way cheaper than any of the commercial support probably. Or you can give donations. But on the FR routing side, so far we're basically kind of the lucky that we don't really worry too much on the money. Also, there are a lot of companies who are using their commercial product and they're actively involved with maintainers and developing. So but it is a big issue, but it's potentially not the main thing I would love to hear from. I'm more interested really like, what can we do that more people here in these countries would start using it? What would it potentially require that somebody would throw their MikroTik router out and toss something in with FR routing? Or something like that, and try that out. Or maybe any of the other projects. Maybe you're using a commercial lawful intercept, you're paying a lot of things, throwing that one out, or at least start looking at that thing. That's what I'm really interested in. So what does it require? And we had also some feedback. How well, so before the Apricot, who knew about the OpenALI project here? Okay, there were still a few, that's good. I guess FR routing is more well known, but there are a lot of other open source projects which may be not that well known. And I heard some feedback. I'm not sure if someone can confirm that obviously the user base, so the chicken and egg problem, because nobody is really using it and much talking about how they're using it, that most of you may be potentially be afraid to be the first. I don't know how much that becomes a problem. Would it help if we are having more talks at some of these conferences and talking about it and where it's going and the features? Is that something which potentially could help?
Martin, there's a statement here on chat from Rob Thomas from Australia. He says that as an open source developer, we have a lot of bad faith committers. There's cryptocurrency rewards for pushing a commit. It is hard to distinguish them from the real ones. As a better description, as an open source developer, we want to welcome new developers and committers. There's a whole process to onboard them, and we as an open source project should be following it. but there's been a recent burst of bad faith commits by people who are trying to earn crypto rewards. It's a really bad state.
So if I want to answer, that's probably the question before, how to get more people contributing. And yes, it's a challenge. It's obviously if people submit a pull request somewhere on a project, assuming most projects these days work with some Git and pull requests, it takes some work to review that. So every time somebody does a pull request, it takes normally some maintainer or somebody to do some reviewing. You can automate it at some level. We do a huge automation for testing, but you still, at the end, somebody needs to look through it. And big factor is that, do I know that person? Has he done commits before? No? Oh, I may have to look a bit closer to that stuff, and it takes more time. And I don't have the time right now, so it is a challenge there.
Philip, my question is unrelated to previous one. Do you want to have a conversation on existing one? If so, please continue.
Maybe. You want to go first, or should I go first?
If it's related, please go ahead.
Everything is related. Alphabetical order, you go first.
Okay, thanks. Anurag Bhatia, Hurricane Electric. I just walked in the room, but when I hear you saying something like, say, what it would take to replace or not have, say, something like MikroTik and use FRR, or maybe a routerized version of, say, VYOS with that. One thing I often find it missing is the documentation with respect to capabilities. If you are a small to mid-size operator and you are trying to identify what sort of hardware would you need and how much capacity it would have? Can you run 10 gigabits on it? Can you run 40 gigabits on it? That is sort of thing which is often missing in these projects. They would talk a lot about configuration, configuration buttons. They would talk a lot about, bits you can enable, disable, but they would not talk that much about the hardware and the throughput expectations, which is an important thing. If you are saying, don't consider a router and consider this Linux box as a router.
Okay, thanks for the feedback. So I can talk first, he can probably talk afterwards. I'm not sure what's in his project. But so yes, I heard that before. So if I understand you correctly, you're not talking about documentation, how to configure it. You're talking about configuration on what platform should you use it.
Yeah.
What features you may have, what the performance is on something, how should you customize something? And yes, that's something I heard a few times, and I think that's a good feedback, and we need to fix that. We had some recent discussion, mainly when people want to do higher bandwidth, because, if I run a Linux PC, I can do like 10 gigabit or so, I think. And we have shown or something, and I want to test it, that yes, there are different solutions. Today, basically, just as a quick message there, so I think around 20 gigabit of traffic, you can use more or less any old PC you have lying around. If you go higher total traffic, then you may need a little better hardware, but we have seen deployments, especially if you start doing things like DPDK or like with the VPP, like above 200 gigabits throughput on a PC, no problem. There are also companies on the other side who, at least in Europe, I know one, who sells customized PCs for FRR as an appliance complete here. You have like a PC with 20, 40 Ethernet ports on it. Basically, it's basically a PC server and selling that. I'm not sure if they're publishing performance data, but it's something we are in discussion with them that we can potentially do something better there.
Okay.
And yes, I see iOS 2, obviously same thing. It's a very nice compact platform to load it. But I think they are just also about starting to do better, like special hardware and talk about it. So I can give that feedback to these folks as well. So thanks for that.
Sure. Yes. Something like a benchmark page with this kind of hardware, and this has been already tested, and not the specific hardware version or model number, but more like this much memory, this specific CPU, or this many cores, and this is the throughput one could.
Yeah. So expect. I see, like, give a few example, a few different platforms or something.
Yeah. Perfect.
Describe it and do that. Okay.
Yes. Hi, my name is Philip Paps. I'm speaking only for myself, but I contribute to a large number of open source projects, most notably the FreeBSD project. You said earlier on what and also I want to chip in on Dave's comment earlier, that, you know, how can we get more contributions from this region and the world? And it sounds like contributions are being equated with contributions of code or contributions of money or contributions of installed deployments. As a contributor to large open source projects, I argue that there are a lot of other ways to contribute to open source that do not involve writing any single line of code or deploying anything, but just reviewing would do a lot of good. Or just trying out things in a lab, in a virtual environment would do a lot of good. If I see random contributors from the internet showing up with, here's a patch that does something, and I've been paid with random cryptographic tokens for it, I worry. On the other hand, if I see someone piping up from somewhere going, hey, I've been reading your documentation because I've been trying to install your operating system in a virtual machine because I listened to one of these crazy people at a conference, and the documentation is a little unclear. This makes it clearer. Those are contributions which we can use. So, you know, to circle back to the original discussion, what can we do? If we keep submitting proposals for talks at conferences in this region for things that are related to open source, but not necessarily peddling open source, that does help a lot. We had a very good talk this morning about using Netbox to drive virtual container environments for proprietary software inside their containers, but that's using open source software. And that gives users experience with open source software. They can then go and contribute documentation, and if they're keen, they can contribute code as well. That was my lightning talk disguised as a question.
Yeah, so what you're essentially saying is to try and normalize that process of using open source and we use the word contributing, but yes, there's a wide range of ways in which people can contribute. I just love seeing conversations even between, completely independent of myself, between people trying to use my software and people helping each other out, and that really, the fact that I don't have to deal with it is also very nice. But the fact that they are, you know, working amongst themselves and doing those little community building, having those interactions is really the best part about being an open source project maintainer.
And normalize is a good word. It's worth remembering that most of us in this room are of a certain generation who grew up with the collaborative internet and here's some software that mostly works, and we have to fix it to make it work for us. That's not really true for the overwhelming majority of users anymore, but encouraging them to speak up when, hey, the documentation is unclear, or this doesn't really work. Bug reports are contributions too.
So for that, I was also wondering, it goes back to my thought, is like, obviously using one thing, but also if they start talking about the experience or something, I think that may be useful. And I was many times wondering, that might be more something for you as part involved with the Apricot or APNIC. Is there a way to get open source as a more constant thing? So I live in Switzerland. I go always at RIPE meetings. We have an open source working group, which I started about 12, 13 years ago. And we basically invite people working on open source projects, talk about it, their experience, features and stuff, and new things, updates, and all the process constantly. Maybe something, maybe in a simpler form, might be something good for this community to consider too, and have frequent talks and get some updates and have that basically kind of like a track, especially about open source.
Dave Phelan from APNIC, speaking for myself. I've got a question for Shane.
All right, go ahead.
Since OpenLI has left the world of Waikato University, have you seen any changes in terms of external contributions or your time to be able to maintain it now that you're not being funded from that arm of the world?
A little bit. So actually the biggest thing from moving outside of the university and into a commercial consulting company is that we now actually have a lot more resources that we can draw upon to to pursue certain things that we might not have been able to pursue before. We can have we have people to assist us with the things like project management and interactions with potential customers, and taking a lot of things off of my plate and off of Richard's plate that we used to just have to manage entirely ourselves. So in that sense, it's been an improvement. And it's also...
So what are the drawbacks?
The drawbacks, I would say, are that you're a bit more answerable to someone. And I say these things about project management and that sort of thing. That also brings with it certain responsibilities. The upcoming pieces of work have to be a bit more justified than they were when I was just sitting in a lab at the university and could kind of just do what I wanted. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That can be a good way to provide direction. But yeah, there are some commercial imperatives that we do have to think about. Is this a thing that might bring more support customers and so on and so forth? But we did still have to consider that at the university anyway, because we still had to pay for ourselves. So it's, swings and roundabouts.
Thanks.
Yes, Philip, random internet troublemaker again. I have another observation about, you mentioned open source track at RIPE meetings. I'm not sure if an open source track is really what's needed, but what works really well at conferences in this region is tutorials on demonstrating, using various bits of software. I did a moderately successful attempt at a Let's Encrypt talk earlier today. That's just all open source automation. Several other conferences have had several other people demonstrating everything from Grafana to, I think FRR has been demoed in different places as well. Giving demos like this on open source software is a great way to at least increase the visibility of open source. Because there's a lot of people who are using open source, but as you said earlier, they're not telling anyone about it. Showing these things off at a conference is good. And wearing one of several conference program committee member hats, if someone submits a credible slide deck using open source software in a way that's relevant to the network operator community, we'll gladly accept it.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Aris. Previously, I was one of the ambassador for Open Networking Foundations, but I don't think now is I can represent the ONF, because you know that ONF now move all the open source project into the Linux Foundation. So I mean, most of the work will be done by the Linux Foundations. Okay, but I want to a little bit refresh my experience in the journey of open source. Actually, I have a very difficult time when I want to contribute for the first time for the open source, right? I was looking for something that I can do for networking, and then I found one of open source project is called Open Networking Operating System. Okay, and then I joined many different events, and finally I can made some small contributions, and with that small contributions actually is bring me to the communities. Okay, so it's easier for me to to know many people working together as a contributor of open source itself. Yeah, so I mean it's always difficult in the first time, but after that, it will be very straightforward when you are joining the open source community. Yeah, and then what I learned from the open source community basically is I mean, the open source is not only it's about the code. It's not only about the source code itself, but it's mostly about like collaborations and like community relationship and so on. So with this kind of attitude and then experience, I mean, I able to connect with the other open source community. Like now I'm helping Kubernetes documentations for like Indonesian language. So I mean, for me, contribution is not always the like source code, right? So whether you are contributing in the testing, you are contributing in the documentations, or you are contributing in testing deployment, it's always considered as contribution. So I mean, for me, I love to continue to work with open source. I mean, like try to use any open solution that we can use it in our what they say research operations or whatever what it is. Yeah. So my what they say comment is whether we want to have some real what they say output from this BoF, right? Regarding how we will move forward to make the open source will be what they say known especially in the Asia Pacific. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the feedback. And if you are back, as you mentioned, to the contributing, obviously reminded me, yes, another way to contributing, many projects do, most of them have public issue tracker. And normally the maintainer not getting to all of that stuff. So that's a great way to contribute too, because you're not coming with a new change directly at the beginning. You basically may read through the open issues, you may try out, add some more information, say, hey, I can reproduce that, and this is what it looks like. That's a great time too, on the general bug fixes, all these things. These are normally the first time contributions, which in many projects will get you in very easy. And once you have done one or two of them, there is like usually way more open. The other thing is also, many communities, FR routing and probably his as well, they have quite open, usually discussions. So there might be mailing lists which are quite active there, which you can look at, not just the Git. In our case, there is a Slack basically there, which is just discussion where developers hang out all the time. We even have a weekly conference call, which is open to anyone in the world, basically on the Slack. And we are talking about all the new issues which showed up, anything. So if people make a new pull request, if they open an issue, we highly appreciate if they show up there, because when we talk and try to figure out what it is, how important it is, what it impacts, if the person who opened it is there, that makes it so much easier, and it's more likely for you that the whole thing will move forward. So, and they, like many other projects, they have similar discussions there. So not just sending something, potentially watch out for feedback, answers and stuff too.
And even just sitting in on some discussions, if you were thinking about becoming a first-time contributor, would probably be quite helpful as well, just to get a sense of what is going on within the project.
Anurag Bhatia again here. One more problem I often see, so again, answering to the question which is written on in the slides, what is stopping you from using more open source is there are many projects, and this includes FRR, where threshold is very low to start, because I don't necessarily need to see all the configuration tabs. You just spin up, you go to VTYSH and start using it. In fact, purely from FRR point of view, majority of us are familiar because it's Cisco-like syntax. But this is not true with many other open source softwares where they don't have, say, a Docker Compose file in there. Forget even support of Docker, where they don't have a working sample config in there. The starting barrier is just so steep in some of the projects where you have to literally go and figure out a basic working, the minimal working configuration just to get started with that. That's again a thing on the documentation side, which often turns one down with these projects.
Yeah, one thing we did with the OpenLI project was I spent a lot of time not only creating a set of tutorials with videos and so on, I built basically a containerized lab and released those Docker files so that people could just download the lab, work through the tutorials which used that lab specifically. So they jump into the containers, put in the configuration. They can replay traffic from PCAPs that I encoded into the containers and see that whether their output matched what was shown in the tutorial. And that effectively gave them a sandbox environment where they could work through a proper worked example and come away feeling like they had a better understanding of the software without having to go through the rigmarole of actually trying to set up a lab or, play on your actual network.
Oh, that's a perfect example. And both of you, your projects where you are primarily contributing, they're excellent. My question, my point
yes,
was
sir.
for in general for the projects, like
Yeah.
why one may not pick a certain project which is open source and threshold is just too steep. Thanks.
Yeah.
Chris Visser from IIJ, and this is kind of related to his one, but also the previous question. I think something that's, as we're talking about the contributing, where like a lot of it's the documentation but we've also discussed about people testing it and writing or like doing stuff externally from it. One of and I know I'm just as bad as probably everybody else, but I think a lot of limitation with the open source projects and stuff is maybe on your specific project, there isn't a documentation or tutorial to do anything, but there's probably about half a dozen other blogs of people doing that. And I think it is a problem sometimes that we don't utilize that knowledge somewhere, like have a showcase of people using it, we don't necessarily want to contain the community, just do everything there, but making use of community contributions outside of the project to help grow it and advertise it in that way. And I don't know what's the best way of advertising those things, because it is work to go and find out if people wrote that. But it could be a good way to use that information already and maybe get somebody to write a blog to come contribute to the code or documentation or stuff. So how to find that balance, I don't know, but something to keep in mind.
So as I just heard Docker again, it's kind of an interesting, for me, that's always like this slightly dangerous thing, because on one side, yes, we do provide Docker container, but the second side is like, if somebody wants to run a real routing engine for their network, I strongly suggest don't use Docker. Docker is great for testing, trying out lab environments, but especially in our case for FR routing, running FR routing in Docker for your live real network is something which you don't recommend. So it's a bit dangerous. Always I wonder, like, so how many people suddenly decide, oh, I can run in Docker, let's just run it in production like that. And that one, I'm a little bit scared on it. But I have another interesting question, because I had that feeling, I'm curious if someone is, if I go in Europe and other things and I talk to universities who do networking training or something, they all basically have these days like labs built up on open source software. They potentially spin up hundreds of FR routing instances and people configure OSPF and BGP between each other and testing and all these things. And not that long ago, when I talked here in Asia, it's more like, oh, we get sponsorship from Cisco, we get a bunch of routers, physical stuff there. And I was curious how much the ones who studied like here in Asia Pacific region and universities, how much did you actually get in touch with open source there compared to get it used to vendor equipment which potentially got donated to university? I'm just maybe like who here actually used open source when they like was studying in somewhere in Asia Pacific and used open source as the main thing?
I went to uni in Australia, so a little bit different. But
yeah,
but we lived on open source. But don't sort of let that fool you, because in most universities in the Pacific, Cisco Net Academy is well entrenched. And they're all teaching Cisco and they all walk out with the CCNA as well as anything else. But I'm of that age that my learned colleague over there keeps poking me with, that we had to roll our own things to make things work. So I think the newer generation, and as someone who trains a lot of these younger network engineers, their exposure to open source for the first time is I don't let people do things the easy way. I don't let you go and install a RPM or a deb package. No, you download and you compile from source, just so they experience the pain and understand why package management systems actually aren't too bad. But they need to understand the errors, they need to understand everything else they're seeing, and they don't get that installing a package. So, and in their 30s, a lot of them have had very limited exposure.
Okay, we're kind of out of time. Thank you for showing up. If you here in the hallway want to talk to me, see me or see him, if you run into some other people who were not in the room because they're not using open source, I would highly appreciate if you potentially can pull them on their arm and bring them over to me, or at least talk to them why not, and potentially let me know. Because I'm really hoping we can somehow make that better and get this more adopted something. Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for your contributions. It's been a very good session. And have a good night.